Hi, this is a special edition of To My Way of Thinking, where we have conversations with tree shakers, policymakers, and those persons in our community, state, and nation who would make a difference. Earlier this year, there was a men's summit held in Jacksonville, Florida. Essentially, it was more of a Black men's summit than anything else on the issues of health and crime and community activism and legal issues and religion and military veterans issues that were talked about at this particular summit held earlier this year. Of particular note, there, of course, are always particular speakers in play that make an impression upon you. The person that made an impression upon me and others at this summit was federal Judge Brian Davis. Here are some of his thoughts on our judicial system in America.
The criminal justice system in America is really something of an embarrassment to the entire world. We incarcerate more people than any other country on the planet, and that says a lot about our values. I'll be glad to discuss in detail the weaknesses and the strengths. One of the things that I learned early on in the system is that the prosecutor is actually the strongest player in the process. It was one of the reasons I left private practice to go back into public service as a prosecutor at a policy level, as a chief assistant in Harry Shorstein's office here locally. And in that, we were able to, in that position, and with Harry's leadership and my assistance, we were able to generate policies that address the disparities that exist in the African-American community. There were more juveniles being arrested and treated as adults when we took office than not. And we changed that and put in place some procedures that help youngsters avoid felony convictions and all of the negative consequences that come with that. So, I'm at a point in my career where I am winding down. I'll be retiring soon, but I have been struggling with how I might best use my time and an effort to continue the struggle that we all engaged in. And some of the early panelists have talked about it, this civic engagement, particularly around voter education and voter registration, is where we need to go. There are some draconian policies, reactionary policies, if you will, in place in the country and in particularly in our state. And they're not going to change. That direction is not going to change as it relates to the criminal justice system and all of the other systems that government touches, which is all of them. And that's not going to change until the leadership changes. The leadership's not going to change until we use that level in democracy that we all have as a matter of our birthright and for which, our history has been bled for. And until we start using it in some ways that are consistent and constructive, it's not going to change. But that's an aside, but it really is not. Because I'll give you an example of something that motivates me. Recently, our governor made this observation that in response to criticism about some of his policies, he said, we are a nation of laws. And that is very true. One of the reasons, as I mentioned, I studied law was because I knew that it touched any and everything that we do. He said, we're a nation of laws. The legislature passes the law. If you don't like the laws, then you have to change the legislation. This is a man who is spearheading the policies, signaling exactly the reason that he's enacting some of the policies that are being enacted. He realizes that we are not in as, I need to get off of this soapbox. I'm gonna pass it back.
And then there was the judge's thoughts on the ballot box, the effect of the ballot box and the criminal justice system. Consider it interesting here in that, of course, the judge himself has never stood for election, not really. His background, of course, is that he is an attorney, Harvard trained and all of that, worked at one of the major law firms in Florida for several years, was appointed assistant district attorney, a state's attorney, as we call it down south here, for several years under the late Edward Austin, who became mayor and became mayor as a Republican, by the way, I might add. Brian served with him as assistant district attorney, and from there was appointed to the bench, to the county and circuit bench in Duval County, where I think he did stand for one election, but judges generally don't have any opposition when they run for election here at this level. And then he was appointed to the federal bench by President Obama in the late 90s, and has remained there for nearly 20 years. So here are his thoughts on the ballot box and the judicial system.
I'll return to the connection between the ballot box and the criminal justice system. I'm stuck on it. Prosecutors elected in Florida, the judges are elected, the public defenders are elected, and those players are shaping the policies that exist within the system. And then there are elected officials that ballot makes, puts in place to determine, the constitution of the Supreme Court, the governor's input into the system. So the importance of, and I'm trying to, we're talking about trying to focus on something as a community. It needs to be focused on the importance of that ballot. And it's true with respect, not just to the criminal justice system, but to all of the systems that we are affected by. And I don't know, I'll leave that out. That's the most important thing. That's what I'm planning to talk about from now on out for the rest of my life, because I do, and it comes to us as a matter of our birthright, and we're just not using it. And until we start using it intelligently and collectively and strategically, this momentum, this direction that we're all lamenting now is not going to go away. It's going to get worse. This is the time. I don't know if you want to recommend this to you. I think it's called Jacksonville Today. WJCT, the public radio and television station, is sponsoring an electronic newsletter. It's like a newspaper. And it talks about the biggest things happening in Jacksonville on your cell phone or your computer every day. It's free. I recommend it to you. There's a young lady there. Her last name is Williams. I think her first name is Elise. But she wrote an article, an editorial called Ringing the Bell. And it is a dynamic call to action, if you will, as to what is happening in our government and how we need to be trying to respond to it. I recommend it to you. So that's an overarching theme. The other thing is, as in most professions, you heard Dr. I'm forgetting the brother's name now, the physician, the inventor of the kidney. Dr. Jones. Yeah, Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones talked about the unavailability of professionals in endocrinology and psychiatry and the underrepresentation. That's a problem in the justice system, period. Law firms are paying new associates, larger law firms. The legal community is changing. It's being concentrated. There are a monopoly. Morgan & Morgan is a good example. They now tout themselves as being the largest in the world. And that's happening across the legal system. They're paying new lawyers with no experience $300,000 a year. Now you compare that to the salaries of the public defenders and state attorney's office and the judges. It is a brain drain, first of all. And then secondly, the opportunities for African Americans to enter the system is being limited by a pipeline constriction. The things that we talked about earlier, reading, writing, the preparation of our children educationally, they're not, I'm working with a group of students at Rains and Ribault now called Future Lawyers and Leaders, just trying to get them involved. But I'm having trouble getting children, young people in our community interested in that. Yeah. That's a different mindset than when I was a young person. It was like, if I had somebody that's active in the community, a lawyer, a doctor, as a matter of fact, one of the reasons I became a judge is I give credit to Earl Johnson all the time. Some of you here are old enough to remember he was on the point of the civil rights movement. I was a kid looking at it and said, wow, you know, these things that have changed in my community, because I remember when the bathrooms used to be stink, the colored bathrooms used to be stink, the water fountains used to be dirty, you know, the back of the bus experience. And I saw this lawyer changing those things. And I grew to appreciate the importance of the law in shaping our community and the importance of being involved with it. That's not the framework, that's not the mentality I'm running to with our young people. Somehow we got to change that. I pulled Alexander Watkins aside, the young man that was here earlier, and said, please have lunch with me. Talk with me more about how to reach that community, because we have to generate the interest, then we have to nurture that interest, then we got to support young people through their educational experience and get them into position in all professions, not just in the law, but we're underrepresented in the largest law firms in the city. We're underrepresented in most of the governmental agencies in the facility. And so to the extent that we need to have people, and I agree with Octavius, just being in the room makes a difference. The conversation changes when you're there. And if you have the fortitude to make the observations that you are living through and you know that your community is living through, you can get attention. There are allies. The other thing that was mentioned earlier that I'd like to say is important is the importance of building collaborations and finding like-minded people, regardless of their race, to be supported. That's been a history that we've had as a community. You know, this struggle from abolition of slavery to the passage of the civil rights movement didn't happen without friends. And that I am always trying to distinguish with young people the difference between that policy that caused the direction that our country came and those that are responsible for it, and whiteness, because they're not the same. And you know, so anyway, we need to strengthen the pipeline and try to encourage young people who are interested in public service at this level to join us if they can.
And I'm glad you mentioned the distinction.
One of the points made at this men's summit in Jacksonville, Florida, earlier this year, of course, the participants were taking questions, was what the judge had mentioned and others had mentioned, is that we don't have as many African-American lawyers in the system in proportion to their white counterparts, and particularly on the prosecution side, that could make a difference in the kind of sentencing that happens, because, as the judge indicated, prosecutors have a great deal of sway, not just here in Florida, but all across the country. And the prosecution is the one who determines what the charges are going to be, the DA's office, and then, of course, the judge takes that into consideration. And even to the extent that what the sentence is going to be depends a lot on what the prosecution recommends. Because of this deficit in African Americans in the judicial system, particularly on the prosecution side, because they could get paid more money if they stay in private practice, it comes to the question of, you know, why can't we find a way to subsidize them when they get into the public sector, or hire more of them independently from the public sector to serve as a prosecutor, so that at least they can be there. There's some thinking that this will help the sentencing. Here's what the judge has to reply about that.
Can I respond? You're underscoring a point. It's not happening because the people in place who would propose that as a governmental policy are not elected. If you were elected, you'd be making that argument and convincing other people that it was the right thing to do. And in connection with your question about being in lockstep, yeah, prosecutor's office can be in lockstep. I'll submit to you that they were in lockstep for a while. They are less so now, but the fact that the governor is appointing and removing, you know, this young woman in Orlando, I think it was removed, which is that was a political decision by the governor that was unprecedented. The influence, and this was the other point I wanted to make in terms of being in lockstep. There are a lot of communities in which you can identify this lockstep between the prosecutors and the public and the police office. And where that gets challenged is out of the United States Justice Department. Under the Obama administration, those police departments were being investigated. The weight of the federal government was being put on them to change the policies. That's not happening as much under the Biden administration, and certainly it was eliminated under the Trump administration. You know, we need to connect these dots for our children to let them know, and the protest is wonderful, the passion, it demonstrates the passion, but it's not gonna move the needle. It'll get coverage on the 6 o'clock news, but until that energy is translated into action at the polls, we're gonna be hearing the same story.
All right, I got time for one more question.
And then there is the law passed by the Florida legislature, and several other states are agreeing to this, that basically will move to penalize protesters who are leading marches that the local law enforcement deemed to be disruptive to the community, that will rule these protesters or marchers or leaders of the protest, rule them as criminally liable for it, and basically could amount to more than a misdemeanor and a felony charge. And of course, there's still the problems that many communities are still believing has happened with the over-enthusiastic arrests and shootings that are taking place with police officers. Here's a final take from Judge Davis on these particular issues having to do with your right to protest and whether or not police or law enforcement personnel have unqualified immunity.
It is organizing and the people involved in the charge. No, but you know, I agree with you. My question is the question you asked. I've got my segregation must go by 64 experience as well, and so I know exactly what you're talking about. And I applaud the efforts. As a matter of fact, one of the things that is so interesting, and it's a case that I happen to handle because it's in the news now. The protests around the George Floyd murder that happened here in Jacksonville resulted in some prosecutions and some lawsuits. And the question of whether qualified immunity should be extended to some officers that were involved in arrests that were alleged to be excessive in their force landed on my desk. And I made a decision in that case that they were not entitled to qualified immunity. And it got affirmed by the 11th Circuit. So, and that's the whole subject matter of this political mudslinging that's going on that's not even getting talked about, because in that lawsuit, the police department admitted that they had used excessive force. But they wanted to argue that they were entitled to it because of qualified immunity. So the protest is important, but I ask the same question: how can we allow a law that says, the organizers of a protest are going to get arrested to stand? We do it by not going to the ballot box to remove the people that enacted it. Really, that's the only way it is gonna change.